Something is moving through the el-Mandeb Strait right now that is going to change everything about this conflict. And I don't mean that in the way every news headline says something is going to change everything. I mean that in the very specific, very measurable, very irreversible sense that when you move 3 aircraft carrier strike groups into the same theater simultaneously, the options available to every player in that theater are fundamentally different from what they were 72 hours ago. Different in ways that cannot be undone by a press release, a diplomatic statement, or a carefully worded back-channel message through Oman. Let me tell you exactly what happened, why it happened, and why the next 72 hours in the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz are unlike any 72-hour window we've seen in this entire standoff. Because there is a specific miscalculation at the center of this story. A strategic error that Iran made that is now producing consequences Iran's planners did not model, did not anticipate, and cannot reverse. And understanding that miscalculation is the key to understanding everything that's about to happen. Stay with me. This one matters. Let's start at the beginning. Because before you can understand why something this large just moved into the Red Sea, you have to understand what Iran thought it was doing. Iran's theory of the Red Sea campaign has been consistent since the Houthis began attacking commercial shipping in late 2023. The logic was elegant in the way that bad strategies are often elegant before they meet reality. Create enough disruption to global energy flows and commercial shipping that the economic cost of the standoff becomes politically unbearable for the countries maintaining pressure on Iran. Make energy prices spike in Europe, strain supply chains across Asia. Make insurance rates for Gulf transit so prohibitively expensive that commercial operators start calling their governments, start lobbying, start demanding that someone negotiate with Tehran, rather than sustain a posture that is costing them billions every single month. And by the metrics Iran was watching, it looked like it was working. Over 100 commercial vessels targeted in the Red Sea since operations began. Global shipping rerouted around Africa, adding 3 to 4 weeks to every voyage and billions in additional fuel and time costs. Red Sea transit insurance rates sitting at 300 to 600% above pre-crisis baseline. Major shipping operators repeatedly suspending Gulf and Red Sea bookings. The economic disruption was real. The pain was real. The pressure Iran was generating was measurable. So Iran escalated. 5 commercial vessels targeted in a 48-hour window. 2 of them hit. The message Iran thought it was sending was simple. We can make this worse. We can turn the disruption up higher, negotiate with us, or watch the numbers climb. That was the intended message. Here is the message that was actually received, and this is where the miscalculation begins to reveal itself. Iran's escalation calculation had one critical flaw built into its foundation. It assumed the response would be political, that the accumulated pain of Red Sea disruption would generate diplomatic pressure on Washington to soften its posture, to open new channels, to offer Tehran something that eased the economic strangulation the blockade was producing. What Iran got was the opposite. The latest wave of strikes didn't fracture the coalition maintaining pressure on Iran. It unified it, and it unified it in ways and with participants that Iran's strategic planners almost certainly did not have in their models. Think about what happened in the 48 hours after those escalated attacks. The United Kingdom, which had been carefully balancing support for the American pressure campaign with its own desire to keep diplomatic options open, formally joined the expanded response framework. Germany, the country whose entire post-Cold War foreign policy was constructed around a principle of military restraint, authorized German naval assets to participate in expanded Red Sea security operations. France repositioned its standing Red Sea assets to what defense analysts are describing as pre-strike positioning rather than defensive patrol. And then there's Japan, whose post-World War II constitution severely constrains offensive military engagement, issued a statement through its defense ministry describing the latest attacks as requiring, and I want you to hear this phrase carefully, a fundamental reassessment of Japan's contribution to Red Sea security. In Japanese diplomatic language, fundamental reassessment is the equivalent of a fire alarm going off in a quiet room. That phrase does not get used casually. That phrase means something has changed. Iran launched an escalation designed to divide the international coalition, maintaining pressure on it. The escalation assembled that coalition into something larger, more unified, and more operationally coordinated than it had been before the attacks. And into that newly unified coalition's operational architecture, the 3rd American Carrier Strike Group just arrived. Let's talk about what that actually means, because the phrase Carrier Strike Group gets used in news coverage in a way that sometimes loses the weight of what it represents in real military terms. A carrier strike group is not a ship. It is a self-sustaining offensive military system. Each carrier air wing carries approximately 65 to 75 aircraft, strike fighters, electronic warfare platforms, airborne early warning, helicopter assets. Multiply that by 3 carriers. Then add the surface combatants accompanying each group. The Arleigh Burke destroyers, each carrying more than 90 vertical launch cells loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles and interceptor missiles, the cruisers. And then, operating below the surface and invisible to satellite imagery, the attack submarines coordinating with the surface groups. The combined strike capacity of 3 carrier strike groups simultaneously positioned in this theater represents the largest concentration of American offensive naval air power in any single region since the opening phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. The last time America did this was when it was about to invade a country. And here is the specific thing that the 3rd carrier group adds that the first 2 couldn't provide on their own: coverage. The Houthi missile threat is not geographically concentrated in one corner of Yemen. Launch sites are distributed across a significant portion of the western coast. Storage facilities are spread across multiple provinces. Command nodes are dispersed specifically to reduce vulnerability to American strikes. 2 carrier groups provide excellent coverage of specific sectors. 3 carrier groups provide simultaneous coverage of the entire threat envelope. There is no longer any geographic area of Houthi-controlled territory that sits outside effective strike range. That is not a subtle shift in the military situation. That is a fundamental change in what options exist. Now let's talk about the targeting failure, because this is the part of Iran's miscalculation that may be the most consequential, and it's the part that's gotten the least attention in most coverage of this story. The 5 vessels targeted in that 48-hour escalation window were not randomly selected. But when you look at what they actually were, you start to see a picture that makes no sense from the perspective of a coherent pressure campaign. 2 of the vessels had documented connections to Chinese shipping interests. 1 carried crew members from a South Asian country that has been carefully neutral throughout this entire standoff. 1 was flagged by a European nation that has been among the most vocal advocates for a diplomatic resolution to the Iran crisis. None of these were American flagged, none were Israeli, none were directly connected to Gulf state governments that Iran considers adversaries. Iran's Houthi proxy attacked shipping connected to China. To neutral Asian nations, to diplomatically sympathetic Europeans, these are not Iran's enemies. These are Iran's potential allies. These are the countries whose cooperation Iran needs to sustain any kind of pressure on Washington. And Beijing's response came within hours of the attacks. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a statement describing the attacks on Chinese-connected shipping as unacceptable and demanding accountability. Read that again: China. The country whose oil purchases are the primary thing keeping the Iranian economy from collapsing under the weight of the blockade. China used the word unacceptable to describe what Iran's proxies just did. When your economic lifeline uses that word to describe your actions, something in that relationship has fundamentally changed. And Iran cannot afford that change. Not now. Not while the blockade is bleeding $500 million per day out of the Iranian economy. Iran's Red Sea strategy was supposed to cause maximum economic pain to the United States and its closest allies. Here's what it actually accomplished economically. And this part of the story is almost never told the way it deserves to be told. The countries paying the highest proportional cost for Red Sea disruption are not the United States. They are developing economies. Countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Africa that depend on affordable Red Sea shipping to access manufactured goods, agricultural inputs, and energy. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the nations of East Africa. These are countries experiencing genuine, measurable economic pain from Iran's proxy campaign. And they are countries with almost no leverage over the political decisions in Washington and Tehran that would resolve it. Iran built an economic weapon aimed at Western governments, and it is hitting hardest the countries that have the least ability to influence the outcome and the most economic vulnerability to the disruption. The weapon is pointed in the wrong direction, and Iran's architects know it. Let's talk about what 3 carrier strike groups in the Red Sea actually enable, because the framing of this deployment as an enhanced defensive measure for commercial shipping is accurate but profoundly incomplete. You do not deploy 3 carrier strike groups to play defense. You do not move the largest concentration of American naval offensive power in 20 years into a theater to escort container ships. You deploy 3 carrier strike groups because you are building the architecture for offensive operations at a scale and persistence that previous deployments couldn't sustain. The Houthi military infrastructure in Yemen, missile storage facilities, radar installations, command and control nodes, anti-ship ballistic missile launch sites has been mapped. Not perfectly. The Houthis have been dispersing and hardening their infrastructure since American and British strikes began in January of 2024, but mapped to a degree that targeting packages exist, are maintained, and are continuously updated by surveillance platforms operating over Yemen. Those targeting packages were built for a strike campaign with the depth and persistence to systematically degrade Houthi strike capability rather than simply suppress it temporarily. This distinction between suppression and degradation is the most important military concept in this entire story. Previous American and British strikes on Houthi targets produced temporary suppression. The Houthis absorbed the damage, dispersed, reconstituted, and resumed operations. The cycle repeated. Suppression disrupts. Degradation destroys. 3 carrier groups provide the sustained sortie rate, the number of strike missions that can be maintained day after day over an extended period that makes a degradation campaign possible where a suppression campaign was the ceiling before. And the response package arriving with the 3rd carrier group is specifically engineered to address every tactical adaptation the Houthis have developed over 18 months of engagement. Mobile launchers that move after firing met with persistent low observable surveillance platforms maintaining continuous coverage. Not periodic passes, continuous. The ability to detect a mobile launcher moving to its firing position, to track it through that movement, to engage it before it completes the launch sequence, taking away the mobility that has been the Houthis' most effective adaptation to American strikes. Underground and hardened facilities that conventional munitions struggled to reach are now facing bunker-penetrating ordnance that previous strike packages didn't carry in these numbers. Dispersed command networks that survived previous targeting are now facing enhanced electronic warfare capability from EA-18G Growler platforms configured specifically for the electromagnetic environment that Houthi communications and targeting infrastructure operates in. Every adaptation the Houthis built over a year and a half of learning is now being directly countered. Here's how this looks from Tehran right now, and I want you to understand that it looks significantly worse than it did 72 hours ago. The blockade on Iranian ports is still running, the economic bleeding is still running, the nuclear program is still advancing, still at a breakout timeline that has been driving urgency in American and Israeli planning for months. And now Iran's primary instrument of leverage, the Houthi strike capability that was supposed to generate negotiating pressure by threatening global shipping, is facing a response architecture 3 times the size of anything it has previously confronted. While simultaneously, the coalition maintaining pressure on Iran has expanded to include the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Australia, and the full basing and overflight cooperation of the Gulf states. Count those flags. Iran launched a campaign designed to demonstrate that American pressure on Iran was causing global economic harm. The campaign assembled a multinational military coalition instead, and in the Persian Gulf, while everyone's attention is on the Red Sea, the character of the American naval presence maintaining the blockade has quietly shifted. Tomahawk-loaded destroyers repositioned from blockade patrol stations to positions optimized for land attack strike range against specific Iranian targets. The pre-delegated authority that American commanders in theater have been operating under, the authority to respond to Iranian military action without White House authorization on individual incidents, extended in scope for the 2nd time since the standoff began. And the B-2 bombers at Diego Garcia, which have been on elevated alert throughout this entire crisis, have had that alert status upgraded again, not launched, alert status upgraded. In military planning language, an alert status upgrade of that specific kind means the decision to use them has been made contingent on a specific Iranian action. The action triggers the launch, no additional authorization required. The trigger is already set, Iran just has to decide whether to pull it. The Iranian Foreign Ministry and the IRGC are almost certainly at odds right now about what to do in the next 48 to 72 hours. The Foreign Ministry looks at the coalition assembled against Iran, looks at China's statement, looks at 3 carrier groups in the Red Sea, and calculates that the cost of continuation is approaching a threshold the regime cannot absorb. The IRGC looks at the same picture and sees backing down as a strategic defeat that emboldens American pressure and removes the primary leverage Iran holds in any negotiation. One of those positions is going to prevail. The Islamabad negotiating track, battered and damaged but technically still alive, either receives new energy from a diplomatic signal in the next 48 hours or it dies. And the back channel through Oman is either going to carry a message that provides cover for de-escalation or it goes quiet. Watch the Omani foreign minister's travel schedule. Watch Houthi communications patterns for disruption that would indicate electronic warfare has been activated. That disruption, when it comes, precedes kinetic action by hours. Watch oil prices at Asian market open. Here is where we actually are. Iran ran a strategy for 18 months that was built on a coherent but ultimately flawed theory of how economic pain translates into political outcomes. The theory required the pain to fall on the right people, to fracture the right coalitions, to generate the right diplomatic pressure. Instead, the pain fell on neutral nations and Chinese shipping interests. The coalition unified rather than fractured. The proxy deniability Iran was counting on failed to prevent the international community from treating Houthi operations as Iranian policy. And the military response that Iran's strategy triggered is now the largest concentration of American offensive naval power in a single theater in over 2 decades. Every pillar of Iran's Red Sea strategy produced the opposite of its intended effect. That is not a setback. That is the definition of a strategy that has comprehensively failed. 3 carrier strike groups are now in the Red Sea. The window in which Iran can choose de-escalation over confrontation is still open, but it is closing, and it is closing fast. Something massive just entered the Red Sea, and it didn't come alone, and it absolutely did not come to watch.